So here we were, sitting in front of the maps, the real maps, not the ones they show on cable news, and something remarkable started to take shape right in front of us. Two operations, two continents, two oil fields, two colossal losses, and one country quietly absorbing the blow with a face carved from stone, China. This was not a coincidence. Anyone who had been watching the chessboard, really watching it the way you watch a grandmaster set up a sacrifice 6 moves before it happens, could see that what unfolded in January and then again in late February of 2026 was not a series of independent foreign policy decisions. It was a sequence, a coordinated dismantling of the energy architecture that Beijing had spent 2 decades patiently, painstakingly, and expensively constructing around itself. We are going to walk through it all together, step by step, layer by layer. Because this story, China's double loss, was one of the most underreported and underanalyzed geopolitical earthquakes of the year. And the deeper you go into it, the more it starts to look less like a coincidence and more like a blueprint. Let us start at the beginning. Not the recent beginning, but the real beginning. The one that explains why Caracas and Tehran, two cities that have almost nothing in common, ended up being the twin pillars of Beijing's global energy strategy. Cast your mind back to the mid-2000s. China was burning coal in quantities that stunned environmental scientists, but it was also waking up to the iron logic of industrial scale. A nation that manufactures for the world needs to be fed by the world. Coal you have at home. Oil you mostly do not. And so Beijing began doing what great powers always do when they face a structural vulnerability. They went shopping, not with a credit card, with a checkbook the size of a continent. The model they developed was elegant in its simplicity. It was called oil for infrastructure lending, and it worked like this. China's state-owned policy banks, primarily the China Development Bank, the largest development finance institution on the planet, extended massive loans to resource-rich countries that Western financial institutions had either abandoned or sanctioned into isolation. In exchange, those countries repaid not in dollars, not in euros, but in oil, in barrels, in the one currency that a growing industrial superpower actually needed. Venezuela was the crown jewel of this model, and what a jewel it was, at least on paper. The Bolivarian Republic sat atop the single largest proven oil reserves on Earth, 303 billion barrels, roughly 17% of everything humanity knew how to extract. In the 1990s, Venezuela pumped 3.5 million barrels per day. China looked at those numbers and saw not a struggling socialist petrostat, but a geological lottery ticket that had been left uncashed. Between 2007 and 2018, a mere 11 years, China poured somewhere between $60 and $100 billion into Venezuela, not in grants, in loans, in joint ventures, in infrastructure projects, in telecommunications contracts, in satellite tracking stations, in the full architecture of what a serious geopolitical relationship looks like when one party is building for the long game. The China Development Bank alone signed 17 separate loan contracts with Caracas. By some estimates, Venezuela absorbed roughly half of all Chinese Development Bank lending to Latin America over that entire period. Half. That number never stopped being staggering. The repayment mechanism was the key. Venezuela would send oil, discounted oil. Oil that bypassed the normal international pricing mechanisms, oil that flowed quietly from Maracaibo to Shandong, refined by the so-called teapot refiners, the small independent Chinese refineries concentrated on the Yellow Sea coast, who were perfectly happy to process barrels that the major Western energy companies refused to touch for sanctions reasons. By the end of 2025, just weeks before everything changed, Venezuela was exporting roughly 952,000 barrels per day. Of that, 778,000 barrels were going to China. Not 51%, not 60%, 81.7%. Beijing had not merely become Venezuela's most important customer. It had become, for all practical purposes, Venezuela's only serious customer. Then came January 3rd, 2026. Now we are getting to the part of this story that most of the major financial outlets buried beneath the fold, if they covered it at all. Operation Absolute Resolve. The American Special Forces operation that entered Caracas in the early hours of January 3rd and removed Nicolas Maduro from power. Maduro was captured. His vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, was sworn in as acting president within 48 hours, and within days she was signaling her readiness to cooperate with Washington. From a purely theatrical standpoint, it was swift, surgical, and the Trump administration called it perfect. But from Beijing's perspective, what had just happened was not a regime change in a distant socialist republic. What had happened was a hostile takeover of an asset that China had spent 2 decades building. The calculations were immediate. Chinese state banks began emergency assessments of their exposure. Morgan Stanley noted that 2 Chinese state-owned enterprises held the largest oil entitlement reserves of any foreign company in Venezuela, 2.8 billion barrels and 1.6 billion barrels respectively, locked inside the Orinoco Belt, home to the heaviest heavy oil on the planet. CNPC, the China National Petroleum Corporation, operated joint ventures with PDVSA that had been running for years through an increasingly baroque network of intermediary traders designed to evade American sanctions. Sinopec had its own exposure. And China Conquered Resources Corp had announced just months earlier a plan to invest more than $1 billion in Venezuelan oil production, targeting 60,000 barrels per day by the end of 2026. All of that was now in question. Washington made its position clear almost immediately. The White House demanded that the post-Maduro Venezuelan government cut economic ties with China, Russia, Iran, and Cuba. Treasury began issuing new licenses that allowed American companies to trade Venezuelan crude, while simultaneously placing restrictions on transactions involving Chinese and Russian entities. The Venezuelan ambassador to China tried to hold the line. He gave press conferences in Beijing insisting that Chinese investment would be honored, that oil pricing would follow markets and not Washington's preferences. But the structural reality was harder to finesse. As one Columbia University energy analyst put it succinctly, Beijing had essentially been running a buyer of last resort operation for Venezuelan crude. With the political transition underway and American oil majors circling Maracaibo like vultures who had been told lunch was ready, China's privileged position was dissolving in real time. And there was another layer underneath all of this, the debt layer, the one that could turn a strategic setback into a financial crisis. China was still owed between $10 and $20 billion in oil shipments. That exposure was not secured by standard sovereign debt instruments. It was collateralized by oil, by the physical flow of barrels, a debt that could only be repaid by a PDVSA that was now operating under new political management, with new American oversight, and with new restrictions on who could receive those barrels. The Rand Corporation published a careful analysis in late January, noting that China's oil-backed debt structure gave Beijing leverage to complicate any comprehensive Venezuelan debt restructuring, in theory, but leverage only matters if you are willing to use it. And Beijing, watching American naval assets in the Caribbean and calculating the military asymmetry with cold precision, was not about to pick that fight, not over Venezuela, not yet. So China absorbed the first blow, lost the privileged access to 778,000 barrels per day of deeply discounted crude, lost the security of knowing that 81% of Venezuela's exports were flowing east, faced an uncertain future for somewhere between $10 and $20 billion in outstanding oil-backed loan claims, and remained officially silent. Then came February 28, 2026. And the detail that nobody was talking about, but that decided the entire energy game, was the number 90%. That was the share of Iran's crude oil exports that ended up, by multiple independent estimates, flowing to China, not to India, not to Turkey, not distributed across some diversified basket of buyers, to China. Let us put that in barrels. In 2025, Iran was exporting roughly 1.55 million barrels per day on its best days, according to Federal Reserve and IMF data. KP Ler, one of the leading commodity data firms, estimated that China was importing approximately 1.38 million barrels per day of Iranian crude. That is the number that the Wall Street Journal cited. That is the number that Reuters used. That is the number that appeared in the South China Morning Post. It was not contested. It was simply not discussed in polite company. This relationship had a foundation that went far deeper than a simple buyer-seller arrangement. In 2021, Iran and China had signed a 25-year comprehensive cooperation agreement, $400 billion. Oil below market price in exchange for Chinese investment in Iranian infrastructure and security cooperation. It was the kind of long-term strategic architecture that the Silk Road traders of the Tang dynasty would have recognized. The exchange of commodities for presence, of energy for influence, of barrels for a foothold on the approaches to the Persian Gulf. And then, on February 28th, American and Israeli air forces launched Operation Epic Fury. The scale of what followed was described by the International Energy Agency, an institution not known for rhetorical excess, as the greatest global energy and food security challenge in history. That is not editorial hyperbole, that is the IEA. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20 million barrels of oil transit every single day, representing approximately one-fifth of global seaborne oil trade, was effectively closed. For China, the arithmetic of disaster was immediate. Since the US-Israel strikes began on February 28th, Iranian production and exports collapsed as infrastructure was hit and shipping halted. Analysts at Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank, estimated that China faced an immediate shortfall of between 1 million and 1.4 million barrels per day from Iran alone. Gone. Not reduced, not rerouted. Gone. At least in the short term, as tankers scattered. Insurance rates for Gulf passage surged 4 to 6 times their pre-conflict levels, and Karg Island, the terminal that historically handled roughly 90% of Iran's crude exports, found itself in the crosshairs of a conflict neither designed nor constrained to protect it. Oil prices told the story with brutal clarity. At the start of 2026, Brent crude was trading around $60 per barrel. By the time markets opened on March 9th, it had surged past $100. The IEA's member nations released stockpiled oil on March 11th in an emergency coordination. It helped marginally. The fundamental disruption remained. Here is what was genuinely extraordinary about this moment, and it is something the mainstream financial press almost universally missed. This was not just one energy shock hitting China. This was 2 energy shocks from 2 different hemispheres hitting China within the same 8-week window. Venezuela in January, Iran in late February, back to back. The 2 sources of discounted, sanctions-evading crude that China had spent billions building supply relationships with, gone from the equation simultaneously. The combined arithmetic was staggering. Iran at 13% of China's total crude imports, Venezuela at roughly 4%, that is approximately 17% of China's total oil import volume, disrupted or eliminated within 2 months. In an economy that imports 70% of its oil, and where that oil powers the factories that supply the global economy, this was not a footnote. This was a stress test. Now let us talk about the response, because this is where the story becomes genuinely interesting and genuinely surprising. Beijing did not panic, and the reason it did not panic tells you something profound about how China had been thinking about its energy vulnerability long before the first American FA-18 took off from the USS Abraham Lincoln on February 28th. The first buffer was raw storage. According to Kairos, a leading energy data analytics firm, China had been building its strategic and commercial oil stockpiles at a remarkable pace. By early 2026, Beijing held approximately 1.4 billion barrels in combined storage, roughly 120 days of import coverage at 2025 consumption levels. The United States Strategic Petroleum Reserve, historically considered the world's largest, held around 415 million barrels. China, as it turned out, had been quietly accumulating a war chest that dwarfed it. And this was not an accident. In the first 2 months of 2026 alone, as American rhetoric toward Iran was reaching a crescendo, China's oil imports had surged 16%. 16%. Chinese planners had seen what was coming or something close enough to it, and they had been filling tanks. The shadow fleet, those aging, unregistered, flag switching tankers that had been the circulatory system of Iran China oil trade for years, had been loading at maximum capacity in the weeks before the strikes began. The shadow fleet itself is worth a moment of attention because it continued to operate even after the conflict began in ways that were remarkable. Satellite data from commercial tracking firms documented persistent tanker movement through the Strait of Hormuz, predominantly bound for China. Iran, selectively and strategically, was granting passage to Chinese vessels while restricting shipping from American and Western-aligned nations. On March 4th, reports emerged that Iran would allow Chinese vessels to pass. On March 5th, the bulk carrier Iron Maiden, operated by Cetus Maritime Shanghai Limited, transited the strait while broadcasting China owner on its identification systems. The Jask oil terminal, Iran's alternative export hub south of the strait, in the Gulf of Oman, saw loading volumes surge to roughly 2 million barrels, an unusually high figure by any historical comparison. Tanker trackers and Kepler analysts estimated that despite all of the disruption, the shadow fleet had supplied close to 12 million barrels of crude through the strait since the strikes began. The supply was reduced. It was not severed. The second buffer was structural. China, as a matter of national energy strategy, had been building toward what analysts were calling an electrostate model, a nation whose power flows from electric generation capacity and domestically controlled renewable infrastructure rather than from imported hydrocarbons. China in 2026 was 85% energy self-sufficient. In 2024, renewables had surpassed oil to become its second largest energy source. China's electricity consumption was more than double that of the United States in 2025. It had added roughly 621 million barrels of oil to its stockpile since 2024, a strategic petroleum reserve that dwarfed America's depleted 415 million barrel reserve. And it remained the world's dominant producer of solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicle batteries, and the rare earth processing infrastructure that all of those technologies required. In other words, while Washington was building aircraft carriers, Beijing had been building battery factories. The Malacca dilemma, the nightmare scenario in which hostile powers could simultaneously block the Strait of Malacca, the Strait of Hormuz, and the Suez Canal, was precisely why Beijing had been investing so aggressively in electrification and domestic energy resilience for more than a decade. The Iran war demonstrated both the reality of China's vulnerability and the partial adequacy of its preparations. A 1.4 million barrel per day shortfall from Iran alone was not nothing. China's teapot refineries in Shandong ran on cheap Iranian crude, and replacement cost in an already stressed global market was significantly higher. The 15th Five-Year Plan, which China's National People's Congress was formalizing in March 2026, was being written in the shadow of this crisis. But China did not face a lights-out emergency. It faced an expensive, painful disruption that its reserves and diversification strategy allowed it to absorb, at a cost, under pressure, but without collapse. Let us pull back and look at the strategic picture, because there is something even larger happening here that requires the kind of long lens analysis that the daily news cycle almost structurally prevents. What was the actual objective of removing Maduro and striking Iran within the same 2 months? The official narratives in Washington were varied and contradictory, but if you strip away the press briefings and look at the structural outcomes, a pattern emerges with clarity. The two countries that had served as the backbone of China's discounted, sanctions-evading oil supply chain, The two countries where Beijing had invested most heavily in creating alternative energy corridors outside of the dollar-denominated international oil market were simultaneously destabilized. Venezuela's political transition placed its oil sector under American management. Iran's conflict disrupted its production capacity and export infrastructure in ways that would take years to repair. 90% of Iran's oil exports had been going to China. 81% of Venezuela's oil exports had been going to China. In one sense, these were numbers about discounted crude, but in another, deeper sense, they were numbers about the architecture of a post-dollar energy world, the world where oil moved in yuan and rubles and 25-year cooperation agreements rather than in petrodollars and swift transfers. That architecture was not destroyed. China's shadow fleet was still running. Russian oil exports to China had surged 41% in the first 2 months of 2026, with Moscow exporting around 2.1 million barrels per day as a partial compensating flow. The power of Siberia pipeline, unlike a Hormuz tanker lane, could not be stopped by a carrier strike group, but Russia alone could not replace the Persian Gulf. The Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, the UAE, Oman combined, represented over 55% of China's total oil import supply. Most of it transited Hormuz, and most of it was now disrupted. The Malacca dilemma was no longer theoretical. It was a live operational reality, playing out in real time on satellite imagery and tanker tracking software. And the lesson Beijing was processing quietly, methodically, over months rather than news cycles, was both clarifying and uncomfortable. For all of its oil for infrastructure diplomacy, for all of its shadow fleets and teapot refiners and cooperation agreements, a significant portion of China's energy supply still flowed through maritime choke points that Washington, when it chose to act, could threaten, disrupt, or restructure to its advantage. Now we arrive at the question that the analysts in Zhongnanhai were asking quietly, and that the rest of the world would eventually be forced to confront. Does the pain accelerate the transformation? There was a school of thought, articulated by energy analysts at Foreign Policy at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy, at the E&E News team at Politico, that argued China would emerge from this crisis counterintuitively with a structural advantage. Not because the disruption did not hurt, it did, but because China's response to the hurt was already built into its industrial architecture. China had added roughly 621 million barrels of oil to its stockpile since 2024. Its strategic petroleum reserve was significantly larger than America's, which had been depleted during the 2022 energy crisis and never fully replenished. China's domestic gas production was at an all-time high, and crucially, China was the world's dominant producer of every technology that allowed a modern economy to reduce its oil dependence. Solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicle batteries, the rare earth processing infrastructure that sat at the base of all of it. The Iran war, in this analysis, was not just an energy shock, it was an accelerant. Every barrel of oil that became too expensive, too disrupted, too geopolitically unreliable was a barrel that strengthened the economic case for electrification in Asia. And in the race toward what analysts were calling the electrostate era, the era where national power derived from electric generation capacity rather than hydrocarbon reserves, China arrived at the starting line with a serious and growing advantage over everyone else. Meanwhile, the IEA noted that Asian countries were ramping up coal use in the short term to address the energy shortfall, while simultaneously observing that the crisis was accelerating the case for domestic renewable deployment. The energy crisis demonstrated with brutal clarity the risks of import dependence. China had understood that lesson 15 years ago and had been building against it ever since. The same European leaders who were telling Trump, "This is not our war," when he asked for military help in the Strait, were privately having very different conversations about supply chain resilience and whether the alternative to American security was a deeper economic relationship with Beijing. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz had visited Beijing in February, And the symbolism was not lost on anyone paying attention. The country that sat at the heart of NATO's European anchor was making commercial calls in China's capital, while American and Israeli air power was operating over Persian Gulf skies. Let us return one more time to the number that started all of this. The number that tied Caracas to Tehran in the context of Beijing's strategic dilemma. In January 2026, Venezuela's oil exports to China was 778,000 barrels per day, 81.7% of the country's total export volume. In 2025, Iran's oil exports to China were approximately 1.38 million barrels per day, 90% of everything Iran sold to the world. Combined, roughly 2.16 million barrels per day. 2 million barrels per day of deeply discounted, sanctions-evading, strategically priced crude oil that had been flowing into Chinese refineries as the product of 20 years of patient diplomatic and financial construction. Within 2 months of 2026, both of those flows were disrupted. The Venezuela flow because Washington removed its political ally and restructured its oil sector under American oversight. The Iran flow because Washington and Tel Aviv launched the largest military operation against Iran in history, with consequences for Iranian export infrastructure that would take years to fully assess. And China's response, patient, expensive, and strategically coherent, was to absorb the shock, accelerate the electrostate transition, deepen the Russia relationship, run the shadow fleet as long as Iran would let it, stockpile what it could, and wait. Wait for what? That was the question that hung over every analysis, every briefing room, every trading floor where someone was trying to price the future of oil in a world where one country had demonstrated with startling clarity that it was willing to simultaneously destabilize both of the major alternative energy corridors that Beijing had spent 2 decades building. Wait for the moment, perhaps, when the answer to the Malacca dilemma was not just more renewable energy and larger reserves, but something harder, something more structural, something that Chinese planners had been gaming through in strategy documents for years. The moment when Beijing concluded that energy security, real energy security, required not just economic construction, but a military capacity to protect its supply lines that Washington could not simply neutralize with 2 carrier groups and a set of targeting coordinates. Or wait perhaps for a different kind of future entirely. The electrostate future, in which oil itself became a declining strategic asset, in which the country that controlled the solar panel supply chain and the battery manufacturing base and the rare earth processing network held more real power than the one that controlled the shipping lanes. The answer to that question was not yet visible in the spring of 2026, but what was visible, what was laid out on the maps, in the tanker tracking data, in the oil flow statistics and the loan exposure assessments and the 5-year plan documents, was the scale of what had already happened. China had lost in rapid succession its 2 most strategically important alternative oil relationships. It had been reminded with painful clarity that building an energy architecture outside of American control was easier in theory than in practice when the other side was willing to use force. And it had begun quietly and methodically to draw the lessons that would shape the next phase of a competition that was only going to intensify. Because in the game of great powers, the game that Halford Mackinder mapped and Zbigniew Brzezinski annotated, and that the strategists of Zhongnanhai were now playing on a board that stretched from the Orinoco Belt to the Persian Gulf, the double loss was real, the pain was real, and the reckoning that would follow it was going to be realer still. The question was never whether China would recover. The question was what kind of world it would build on the other side of this disruption, and whether the next time Washington reached for the chess piece marked energy corridor, Beijing would already have moved 3 spaces ahead. That question, as of the spring of 2026, remained wide open. And it was the most important geopolitical question nobody in the mainstream press was asking loudly enough.